Picture this, the grand cathedral in Rome, bathed in golden candlelight, the air thick with incense and the murmurs of prayer. It's Christmas Day in the year 800, and a towering figure kneels before the altar. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, crowned by the Pope himself as Emperor of the Romans. The crowd erupts in awe, witnessing the rebirth of an imperial legacy in the West for the first time in centuries. This moment, shimmering with ambition and divine blessing, marks the dazzling peak of the Carolingian Empire. But how did this mighty realm emerge from the fractured remnants of Europe's past? And why, just over a century later, would it crumble into fragments, leaving behind echoes of its glory? The Carolingian Empire wasn't just another kingdom in the medieval world. It was a lightning strike of culture, conquest, and vision that reshaped Europe forever. Imagine a continent still reeling from the collapse of Rome, its lands divided, its people yearning for order. Then came Charlemagne and his dynasty, warriors and scholars who carved out an empire stretching from modern-day France to Germany, Italy, and beyond. They revived learning, codified laws, and even laid the groundwork for the nations we know today. But empires, no matter how brilliant, are never eternal. Behind the glittering mosaics and grand palaces, forces were already at work that would unravel everything. This is the story of how a kingdom rose to dizzying heights, and how the very ambitions that built it sowed the seeds of its downfall. We'll walk the halls of power where emperors and nobles schemed, march with the armies that expanded borders, and uncover the quiet rebellions and betrayals that chipped away at its foundations. From the blood-soaked battlefields to the serene scriptoria where monks preserved ancient knowledge, the Carolingian Empire's tale is one of triumph, transformation, and tragedy. So let's step back into an age of knights and scholars, of sacred crowns and shattered dreams, and discover how an empire that once united Europe became a memory, but left a legacy that never truly faded. Before the Carolingians could rise, Europe had to endure the slow collapse of the Merovingian dynasty. Once mighty kings, now reduced to figureheads, their power drained by generations of infighting and inertia. They were called the do-nothing kings for good reason, long-haired monarchs who rode in ox carts while real authority slipped into the hands of their ambitious stewards, the mayors of the palace. Among these power brokers, one family stood out: the Arnulfings, later known as the Carolingians. Their story begins not with crowns but with shrewd politics and battlefield triumphs. It was Charles Martel, the Hammer, who first turned the family's growing influence into legend. In 732, his Frankish warriors shattered an invading Umayyad army at Tours, halting Islam's advance into Western Europe. But Martel's son, Pepin the Short, faced a different kind of battle, one of legitimacy. The Merovingians still sat on the throne, their symbolic power lingering like a ghost. So Pepin made a bold move. He sent messengers to Pope Zachary with a loaded question: who truly deserved to rule, the man with the crown or the man with the power? The Pope's reply was a masterpiece of political theater. Power should belong to him who exercised it. With that blessing, the last Merovingian king was tonsured and packed off to a monastery, and in 751, Pepin was anointed king in a ceremony steeped in sacred oil and strategic brilliance. This wasn't just a coup, it was a revolution in how rulers claimed authority. The Pope's endorsement transformed the Carolingians from warlords into God's chosen dynasty. In return, Pepin crossed the Alps to defend Rome from the Lombards, gifting conquered lands to the papacy in the donation of Pepin, a deal that forged an unshakable alliance between throne and altar. By the time Charlemagne inherited the crown, the stage was set. The Carolingians weren't just kings, they were the defenders of Christendom, the architects of a new order. Yet in their rise lay a paradox: the very partnership with the church that made them mighty would one day strain under the weight of imperial ambition. Charlemagne didn't inherit an empire, he built one with blood, faith, and relentless ambition. Born around 742, the eldest son of Pepin the Short, young Charles grew up in a world where power was measured by the sword and sanctified by the cross. Even as a child, he stood apart, tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes and a mind sharpened by the political intrigues of his father's court. By the time he shared the throne with his brother Carloman after Pepin's death, the Frankish kingdom was already a tapestry of rival nobles and simmering rebellions. But Charlemagne wasn't content to merely reign. He dreamed of something far grander, a Christian empire that could rival ancient Rome. His first test came swiftly. When the Lombards in northern Italy threatened Pope Adrian I, Charlemagne marched his army across the Alps in 773, not as a mercenary for the church, but as its sworn protector. The Lombard capital, Pavia, fell after a grueling siege, and their king, Desiderius, was hustled off to a monastery, a fate that seemed almost poetic for the foes of the Carolingians. With the Lombard crown melted down and reforged as a gift for the Pope, Charlemagne didn't just secure Italy, he cemented the alliance between Frankish might and papal authority. But the Lombards were merely the opening act in a lifetime of conquest. The Saxons, pagan warriors of the northern forests, proved far more stubborn. For over 30 years, Charlemagne waged a brutal campaign to crush their resistance, a war less about territory and more about ideology. The Saxons clung to their gods, their sacred groves, and their independence. Charlemagne, however, saw their submission as divine mandate. At Verdun in 782, he ordered the execution of 4,000 Saxon prisoners, a chilling warning of the price of defiance. Yet even after forced baptisms and mass deportations, Saxon revolts flared like embers in the wind. It wasn't until their leader, Widukind, finally knelt to be baptized in 785 that the conflict began to ebb. This wasn't just conquest, it was cultural annihilation, reforging a people through fire and faith. Beyond the battlefield, Charlemagne's genius lay in his vision of unity. He understood that an empire couldn't survive on swords alone, so he surrounded himself with scholars, men like Alcuin of York, who turned his court at Aachen into a beacon of learning. Monasteries became workshops of knowledge where scribes copied ancient texts in a new, legible script we now call Carolingian minuscule. Laws were standardized, weights and measures unified. Even the chaotic patchwork of local dialects began to cohere under the guiding hand of imperial decrees. Charlemagne didn't just rule, he engineered a civilization. Yet for all his triumphs, the emperor's relationship with the church was a delicate dance of mutual dependence and quiet tension. The Pope had crowned him, yes, but Charlemagne never let Rome forget where true power lay. When Pope Leo III was nearly blinded by Roman conspirators, it was Charlemagne who restored him, then sat in judgment over his accusers, a king playing arbiter for Christ's vicar on earth. Their partnership was symbiotic, but it raised a dangerous question. Did the emperor serve the church, or did the church serve the emperor? That ambiguity would haunt his successors. By the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne had forged an empire unseen in the West for centuries, a realm where Latin liturgy echoed in newly built cathedrals, where envoys from Baghdad and Constantinople marveled at the palace school in Aachen, and where the very idea of Europe as a cultural entity began to take shape. But empires are fragile things, and the brilliance of Charlemagne's reign cast long shadows. The same ambition that built his legacy would, in the hands of lesser men, become the cracks that shattered it. Christmas morning in the year 800 unfolded like a scene from an imperial dream. Charlemagne, clad in the robes of a Roman patrician, knelt in prayer before the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. Then, without warning, Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed a golden crown upon the king's head, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. The assembled crowd erupted with cheers, their voices shaking the vaulted ceilings as they hailed Charlemagne with the ancient titles once reserved for Augustus and Constantine. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a seismic shift in European history, a moment where the fractured West dared to imagine itself whole again. The symbolism was as deliberate as it was audacious. By reviving the Roman imperial title after a 300-year absence in the West, Leo and Charlemagne were stitching together two worlds, the Christian present and the classical past. The crown itself whispered of borrowed glory crafted in the Byzantine style, but inscribed with biblical kings rather than Eastern emperors. Even the location was charged with meaning. Rome, the eternal city, now stood as the stage for a new kind of ruler, one who wielded the sword of the Franks but spoke the language of Roman law. For Charlemagne, this wasn't merely about prestige. It was a divine mandate, a calling to unite Christendom under a single earthly guardian. Yet behind the pageantry lay a web of political calculation. Leo, still recovering from the humiliation of his near mutilation by Roman nobles the year before, needed Charlemagne's protection as much as the king desired legitimacy. Their alliance was a masterclass in mutual survival. By crowning Charlemagne, the Pope gained a sworn defender of the Church, while the Frankish king, now emperor, could claim his authority flowed not just from conquest but from God's own vicar on earth. It was a delicate fiction, one that blurred the lines between spiritual and secular power. Did the Pope make the emperor, or did the emperor uphold the Pope? That ambiguity would haunt European politics for centuries. The reaction from Constantinople was icy. To the Byzantine emperors who saw themselves as the sole heirs of Rome, Charlemagne's coronation was an act of rebellion. Empress Irene, no stranger to power struggles herself, bristled at the notion of some Frankish upstart sharing the imperial title. Diplomats scurried between courts offering half-hearted compromises. Perhaps Charlemagne could be styled Emperor of the Franks instead. But the West had tasted renewal, and there was no going back. What made this moment truly revolutionary wasn't just the revival of an empire, but its reimagining. Charlemagne's Rome wasn't a carbon copy of the past. It was a fusion of Germanic warrior culture, Christian piety, and Roman administration. His court at Aachen buzzed with scholars from Ireland and Italy, debating philosophy next to battle-scarred generals. His legal reforms borrowed from Justinian's codes but were enforced by counts who'd grown up reciting Frankish epic poetry. Even the title, Emperor of the Romans, masked a deeper truth. This was a distinctly European empire, one that looked forward as much as it revered the past. Yet for all its grandeur, the coronation sowed seeds of tension that would later fracture the Carolingian world. By tying imperial authority so closely to the Church, Charlemagne unwittingly made future emperors dependent on papal approval, a dependency that would explode into conflict during the investiture controversy centuries later. And by centering his empire on personal charisma and military prowess, he left no clear system for succession beyond the old Frankish tradition of dividing lands among heirs. The brilliance of that Christmas day in 800 was undeniable, but like all great turning points, it carried within it the whispers of its own unraveling. Charlemagne understood that true power wasn't just carved by the sword, it was etched in ink and illuminated by knowledge. While his armies expanded borders, his scholars embarked on a quieter conquest, a renaissance of learning that would rescue ancient wisdom from the brink of oblivion. This wasn't mere patronage, it was a cultural revolution. Monasteries, once humble outposts of prayer, transformed into bustling workshops of the mind. Scribes hunched over parchment, their pens meticulously copying long-forgotten texts by Cicero and Augustine, while poets composed verses in Latin so elegant it would make Rome's ghosts weep. At the heart of this revival stood Alcuin of York, a Saxon monk with a towering intellect, whom Charlemagne summoned to his court like a general recruiting his finest strategist. Alcuin's influence was seismic. he reorganized education into a three-part system: grammar, logic, and rhetoric, known as the trivium, laying the foundation for medieval universities. Under his guidance, palace schools became crucibles of thought, where noble sons studied alongside low-born scholars, all drilled in the art of clear expression and disciplined reasoning. Imagine the scene: a Frankish warrior's heir passing Latin verbs next to a monk who'd grown up tending sheep, both united by the emperor's decree that ignorance is the enemy of faith. Charlemagne himself, though never fluent in Latin, attended these lessons with the fervor of a man determined to civilize his realm from the inside out. But perhaps the most enduring innovation was Carolingian minuscule, a script so precise it revolutionized writing itself. Earlier manuscripts were a chaos of regional styles, their letters sprawling like drunken soldiers across the page. Alcuin's scribes streamlined them into uniform, legible characters with spaces between words, an idea so simple yet radical it made texts accessible even to weary-eyed monks copying by candlelight. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about preservation. Without this script, Aristotle's logic or Virgil's poetry might have vanished into the murk of the Dark Ages. Even today, when you read a modern font, you're seeing the ghost of Carolingian minuscule in every crisp serif. The scale of this intellectual project was staggering. Charlemagne's court became a magnet for Europe's greatest minds: the Lombard Paul the Deacon, the Visigoth Theodulf, the Irishman Dicuil, each contributing to a tapestry of knowledge that blended Christian theology with classical philosophy. Libraries bulged with carefully corrected Bibles, scientific treatises, and even star charts drawn from Arab astronomy. For the first time since Rome's fall, Europe had a shared language of thought, one that crossed tribal borders and whispered of unity. Yet this Renaissance had a darker edge. The same zeal that preserved pagan classics also burned heretical texts. Scholarship served empire. Charlemagne's laws demanded that priests preach in standardized Latin, erasing local dialects in the name of holy uniformity. And while Alcuin preached mercy, his pupil Charlemagne enforced orthodoxy with iron. Saxon rebels who rejected baptism faced execution, their blood staining the same soil where monks penned psalms of peace. This was the Carolingian paradox, a revival built on both open-minded inquiry and unyielding control, where the light of learning cast long shadows of coercion. By the time Alcuin retired to the Abbey of Tours in 806, his legacy was indelible. The manuscripts flowing from scriptoria became Europe's intellectual lifeline through the turbulent centuries ahead, their pages surviving Viking raids and feudal wars. Charlemagne's dream of a literate, united Christendom would fracture politically but culturally. It never truly died. The next time you glance at a printed book or trace the roots of a university lecture hall, remember, those threads lead back to a Frankish king who believed an empire's soul was shaped not just in battle, but in the quiet glow of a scribe's lamp. Charlemagne's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, a patchwork of conquered peoples and restless nobles. How could one man rule such a vast realm without the bureaucracy of ancient Rome? The answer lay in a web of loyalty, law, and sheer logistical cunning. At its heart were the missi dominicii, the emperors, envoys of the Lord, pairs of trusted bishops and nobles who roamed the empire like royal detectives. Armed with parchment scrolls listing the latest decrees, they'd descend unannounced on counties, hearing grievances, inspecting tax records, and ensuring no local lord grew too ambitious. Picture these inspectors arriving at dawn, their cloaks damp with morning mist, demanding to see whether a count's judgments aligned with imperial law. It was governance as theater, a constant reminder that the emperor's gaze reached even the remotest valleys, but the missi were only one thread in the tapestry. Daily administration fell to the counts, warrior aristocrats appointed to rule regions roughly the size of modern counties. These weren't pencil-pushing bureaucrats, they were battle-hardened Franks expected to muster troops, collect taxes, and preside over courts, all while keeping their own ambitions in check. Charlemagne shrewdly rotated them between territories to prevent roots from forming, uprooting a count from Burgundy and replanting him in Saxony before local loyalties could threaten imperial unity. Yet this system had a flaw. The counts weren't paid salaries. Instead, they took a cut of fines and taxes, a temptation that often turned enforcers into exploiters. The missi might haul an abusive count before the emperor, but by then the damage to peasant trust was often done. Control required more than manpower, it needed codified rules. Enter the capitularies, Charlemagne's sprawling collection of decrees that governed everything from grain storage to the proper chanting of psalms. Unlike the rigid legal codes of Rome, these were adaptable, issued as needed like legislative bulletins. Some tackled grand themes. A capitulary from 802 required all free men to swear allegiance directly to the emperor, binding them beyond feudal ties. Others revealed startling granularity. One law mandated that priests keep homing pigeons to speed communication, while another dictated the exact width of bread loaves to prevent baker fraud. This wasn't just micromanagement, it was an attempt to standardize a fractured empire through shared daily rhythms. The genius and fragility of this system lay in its personalization. Charlemagne's governance worked because he was the gravitational center, his authority radiating from annual assemblies where nobles gathered like a parliament of wolves. At these meetings, held in open fields or royal estates, the emperor would listen to complaints, issue new capitularies, and redistribute lands like a poker player shuffling chips. No count dared miss these summits. Absence signaled rebellion. Yet this intimacy also made the empire perilously dependent on one man's energy and charisma. A lesser ruler couldn't sustain the momentum, a truth Charlemagne's heirs would learn the hard way. Beneath the counts and missi thrived a quieter innovation, the written record. Scribes in royal chapels produced triplicate copies of decrees, their quills scratching against parchment as they preserved orders for monasteries, courts, and traveling envoys. Administrative letters crisscrossed the realm, some bearing the emperor's own rough Latin, peppered with corrections from scholars. This paperwork revolution allowed decisions made in auctions halls to echo in Breton fortresses and Bavarian churches with unprecedented speed. For the first time since Rome's fall, Europe had a government that ran on ink as much as iron. Yet for all its sophistication, the system strained against human nature. A count in distant Aquitaine might delay implementing unpopular laws, betting the missi wouldn't come for years. Local courts still favored kin over strangers despite imperial decrees. And the sheer diversity of the empire, Basque shepherds, Romanized Gauls, newly baptized Saxons, meant no single set of rules fit smoothly everywhere. Charlemagne's solution was often brute force. When the Lombard noble Ariches plotted rebellion, the emperor had him blinded, a grim warning against disloyalty. The Carolingian machine balanced on a knife edge between order and oppression, between unity and the fractures no administration could fully heal. What emerges isn't just a blueprint for medieval rule, but a portrait of Charlemagne's governing philosophy, his belief that an empire could be designed like a monastery's herarium, with each hour and role accounted for. The capitularies reveal a ruler obsessed with detail. The missi reflect his distrust of decentralized power, and the counts embody his pragmatic blend of reward and threat. This wasn't Rome reborn, but something new, a hybrid of Germanic custom, Roman aspiration, and Christian idealism. For a few glittering decades, it worked well enough to make Europe believe in unity. But systems built around one man's will rarely survive his passing, and even the mightiest administrative machine couldn't outpace the ambitions of those waiting to inherit it. Charlemagne's armies moved like a force of nature, disciplined, relentless, and brutally efficient. At their core were the Scara, elite cavalry units clad in chainmail hauberks that shimmered like fish scales under the sun. These weren't the lumbering knights of later medieval lore. They were mounted shock troops wielding longswords and throwing axes with terrifying precision. Yet the true backbone of Carolingian military power lay in its logistics. Before each campaign, royal stewards would stockpile grain in fortified depots along planned routes, while blacksmiths forged thousands of iron spearheads in standardized sizes. This wasn't just an army, it was a well-oiled machine fueled by imperial foresight. The tactics blended Frankish ferocity with Roman-inspired strategy. When facing the Lombards in Italy, Charlemagne avoided pitched battles, instead starving cities into submission with calculated sieges. Against the nomadic Avars in the east, he adapted their own hit-and-run tactics, using light cavalry to harass their encampments before crushing them in a pincer movement at the Danube. But it was the Saxon Wars that revealed the army's darkest edge. After a surprise attack annihilated his rear guard at the Suntal Mountains, Charlemagne responded with a scorched earth campaign, burning sacred groves, executing rebels, and deporting entire communities to break their spirit. War wasn't just about territory, it was a tool of cultural annihilation. Expansion brought staggering wealth. The sack of the Avar Ring in 796 yielded wagon-loads of gold, so much that Charlemagne flooded European markets with it, destabilizing the economy for decades. Conquered regions like Bavaria and Lombardy paid tribute in wine, iron, and slaves, while border marches acted as buffers against new threats. Yet this very success bred fragility. Each new territory required garrisons, draining manpower from the heartland. Local elites bought off with land grants grew restless under distant rule. And the constant campaigning eroded the peasant base. Free farmers who once formed the infantry now struggled under the weight of supplying never-ending wars. The military's greatest strength, its dependence on the emperor's personal leadership, became its fatal flaw. Charlemagne's presence alone could inspire loyalty from rival factions, but his successors lacked the same aura. When his grandson Louis the Pious preached mercy rather than martial glory, hardened veterans scoffed. The system relied on a warrior king, and without one, the empire's sword arm grew sluggish. Even the vaunted Scara degenerated. By the mid-9th century, many traded their imperial insignia for the livery of regional strongmen. The army that had forged an empire now accelerated its fragmentation as ambitious counts turned their troops into private retinues. What began as a mechanism for unity ultimately became a catalyst for division. The very campaigns that filled Otto's coffers with gold also stretched the empire's cohesion to breaking point. Charlemagne's genius had been to balance conquest with assimilation, but his heirs found the scales tipping toward chaos. The lesson was clear: an empire built on the sword must forever keep swinging it, lest the blade turn inward. Charlemagne's death in 814 wasn't just the passing of a king, it marked the end of an era. The great emperor, now 72, had ruled for 46 years, a span unheard of in the medieval world. As his body was laid to rest in the octagonal chapel at Aachen, mourners whispered that a giant had fallen. The empire he built stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the Pyrenees to the Elbe, a realm so vast it seemed to defy the very instability of the age. Yet for all his triumphs, Charlemagne left behind a paradox, a glittering legacy intertwined with unresolved tensions that would soon unravel his life's work. In the immediate aftermath, Europe grappled with the weight of his absence. Poets and chroniclers rushed to immortalize him, crafting an image of the wise, bearded patriarch, a warrior scholar who'd carried Christendom on his shoulders. Einhard, his biographer, painted him as almost superhuman, a man who could lift 3 grown knights in full armor, who bathed in natural hot springs with 100 guests, and who slept with wax tablets under his pillow to jot down midnight ideas. This myth-making served a purpose. It turned Charlemagne into a symbol of unity, a golden standard against which future rulers would forever be measured. But behind the hagiography lay thornier truths. The most pressing issue was succession. Charlemagne had carefully prepared for this moment, crowning his son Louis the Pious as co-emperor years earlier. Yet the Frankish tradition of dividing kingdoms among heirs still lingered like a ghost. Though Charlemagne avoided splitting his empire, a lesson learned from the Merovingian chaos, he left Louis a realm too massive for any one man to control. The centrifugal forces were already stirring. Regional nobles chafed under centralized rule, conquered peoples like the Saxons nursed old grievances, and the church watched eagerly, ready to fill any power vacuum. Louis, a pious man more comfortable in a monk's robe than armor, inherited not just a crown but a ticking clock. Decentralization loomed as the empire's silent killer. Charlemagne's system relied on counts and bishops who owed loyalty directly to him. But what happened when the emperor's grip weakened? The missi dominici, those roving enforcers of imperial will, began staying closer to home, their inspections growing sporadic. Local courts increasingly favored regional customs over capitularies, and the great aristocratic families, sensing opportunity, started treating their offices as hereditary possessions rather than imperial appointments. The machinery of governance, so meticulously crafted, began rusting the moment its architect was gone. Even Charlemagne's cultural renaissance carried seeds of fragmentation. The very monasteries that preserved classical texts also became power bases for ambitious abbots. The standardized Latin that had bound the empire together now highlighted the growing divide between educated elites and commoners speaking nascent Romance and Germanic dialects. And the illuminated manuscripts, those dazzling works of art, increasingly celebrated local saints and traditions, quiet acts of resistance against imperial homogeneity. Perhaps the greatest irony lay in the Church's role. Charlemagne had wielded it as a tool of unity, but his coronation by the Pope set a dangerous precedent. By making the imperial title dependent on papal approval, he'd unintentionally handed Rome a weapon future popes wouldn't hesitate to use. The deal struck in St. Peter's Basilica on that Christmas day would echo through the investiture controversy and beyond, as emperors and popes clashed over who truly held God's mandate. Charlemagne's legacy, then, was a tapestry of light and shadow. He'd revived learning, forged an empire, and given Europe a fleeting glimpse of unity. But he'd also left a blueprint without an heir capable of following it, a centralized system too dependent on one man's genius, and a church empowered enough to challenge his successors. As the 9th century unfolded, these contradictions would play out in civil wars, Viking raids, and the slow crumbling of imperial authority. The Carolingian Empire hadn't fallen yet, but the cracks were already there, invisible to mourners weeping beside Otchan's marble tomb, waiting only for time to widen them. Louis the Pious never wanted an empire, only a kingdom of heaven on earth. Crowned co-emperor in 813, while his father Charlemagne still lived, he arrived at the throne with a monk's humility rather than a conqueror's swagger. Tall and gaunt, with a face perpetually drawn in solemn reflection, Louis embodied the contradictions of his name, pious by nature yet charged with ruling a warrior's empire. His first act as sole ruler was telling he expelled his father's mistresses and their illegitimate children from court, replacing the vibrancy of Otchan's palace with the austere rhythms of monastic discipline. The message was clear: this would be an age of repentance, not expansion, but empires built by the sword rarely thrive under the cross alone. The cracks appeared swiftly. Unlike Charlemagne, who balanced faith with pragmatism, Louis saw governance through a lens of religious idealism. He reformed monasteries with fervor, yes, but also alienated the very nobles whose loyalty propped up Carolingian rule. When he stripped titles from courtiers deemed morally lax, the aristocracy bristled. Worse still, his 3 sons Lothair, Pepin, and Louis watched as their father's favor tilted toward his younger half-brother Charles, born from a second marriage. The Ordinatio Imperii of 817 was Louis's desperate bid to prevent chaos. This elaborate succession plan carved the empire into 3 spheres. Eldest son Lothair would inherit the imperial title and central lands, while Pepin and young Louis received Aquitaine and Bavaria. Little Charles, just a child, was given nothing but oversight that would soon ignite dynastic powder kegs. What made the ordinatio unique wasn't just its division, but its attempt to enforce unity. Lothair, as co-emperor, would theoretically oversee his brothers, preserving the empire's cohesion. The document dripped with biblical references, framing the arrangement as divine will. Yet it ignored hard truths. Pepin and Louis the German had already tasted autonomy as sub-kings, and neither would bow easily to their brother. The Church's enthusiastic endorsement of the ordinatio revealed another flaw. By leaning so heavily on religious sanction, Louis had made the papacy a power broker in Carolingian inheritance. When popes could anoint emperors, they could also undermine them. Disaster struck in 829. Louis, swayed by his second wife Judith, revised the ordinatio to include young Charles, the future Charles the Bald, granting him Swabia and Alsace. To his elder sons, this wasn't just favoritism, it was betrayal. The empire erupted in civil war, a grotesque family feud played out with armies. Lothair allied with Pope Gregory IV to depose his own father, temporarily forcing Louis into monastic confinement in 833. Though Louis regained power 2 years later through a coalition with Pepin and Louis the German, the damage was done. The precedent of sons overthrowing fathers shattered the Carolingian mystique of divine kingship. Louis's final years were a tragic coda. The once devout emperor, now broken by rebellion, watched helplessly as Pepin died in 838, prompting another violent reshuffling of territories. When Louis himself succumbed to illness in 840 on an island in the Rhine, his empire was already fracturing along the seams he'd stitched with such pious hope. The sons he tried to reconcile through scripture would soon meet at Fontenoy in 841 for one of the bloodiest battles of the medieval age, their armies drenching French soil in Frankish blood. The irony was brutal. Louis, the man who sought harmony above all, presided over the unraveling of his father's masterpiece. His reign exposed the fatal weakness of Charlemagne's system. It required not just strength but adaptability. Where the father had blended iron fist and velvet glove, the son offered only open palms, and the empire slipped through his fingers. The Carolingian crown still glittered, but its light now illuminated not unity but the gathering storm of division. The battlefield at Fontenoy in 841 was a charnel house brother against brother, Frankish blood soaking the same soil their grandfather Charlemagne had united. This wasn't just a civil war, it was the violent unraveling of an imperial dream. When the slaughter ended and the survivors limped away, the Carolingian dynasty faced an impossible truth: the empire could no longer hold. 3 years later, in 843, Louis the Pious's surviving sons Charles the Bald, Lothair, and Louis the German met in Verdun, a quiet town along the Meuse River, to carve their inheritance like butchers dividing a prized steer. The treaty they signed didn't just split lands, it redrew the map of Europe in ways that still echo today. Lothair, as the eldest, kept the hollow crown of emperor and the so-called Middle Francia, a sprawling, vulnerable corridor stretching from the North Sea to Italy. On paper, it was the prize, Rome, Aachen, and the symbolic weight of Charlemagne's legacy. But geography cursed it. Wedged between his brothers' territories, this central strip lacked natural defenses, its long borders impossible to guard. To complicate matters, Middle Francia itself was a patchwork of languages and loyalties: Burgundian nobles, Provençal peasants, Lombard lords, all united only by their reluctance to bow to a distant Frankish ruler. Lothair's inheritance was less a kingdom than a highway for future invaders. West Francia, granted to Charles the Bald, became the nucleus of what we now call France. Rich in vineyards and Roman roads, its heart was the Seine Valley where Paris would later rise. But Charles faced immediate challenges. The Breton chieftains in the west rejected Frankish rule outright, while Aquitanian nobles saw the treaty as a chance to revive their own autonomy. Worse, Viking longships had begun probing the Loire and Seine estuaries, raiders drawn like wolves to the scent of division. Charles's court became a whirlwind of diplomacy and desperation. bribing some chieftains while fighting others, always one step ahead of collapse. East Francia, governed by Louis the German, was the wild card, a land of dense forests and Saxon warriors, its dialects already mutating into early German. Unlike his brothers, Louis ruled a populace with little memory of Rome. Here, the Carolingian system adapted to frontier realities. Dukes replaced counts as regional strongmen, and missionary bishops wielded swords alongside crosses. This eastern realm lacked West Francia's wealth but bred hardened warriors, a trait that would later fuel the Artenian dynasty's rise. The true tragedy of Verdun wasn't just the division but its short-sightedness. The brothers treated the empire as personal property, ignoring the cultural and economic arteries Charlemagne had painstakingly woven. Trade routes between the Mediterranean and North Sea now crossed hostile borders, tolls strangling commerce. Monastic networks, once the empire's glue, fractured along political lines. Bavarian scribes stopped copying texts from Tours, and the scholarly Latin that had unified elites began to splinter into early French and German. Even the church, which had blessed the treaty, soon regretted its role as papal letters to Lothair went unanswered while Viking raiders sacked undefended monasteries. Most fatefully, Verdun created borders where none had existed. The idea of separate eastern and western realms, still fuzzy in Charlemagne's time, now hardened into reality. When Lothair's Middle Francia disintegrated, chewed apart by his heirs and invaders, the rift between East and West Francia became permanent. The old Roman road connecting Aachen to Rome, once the empire's spine, became a no-man's land of petty kingdoms. By the time the Carolingian line flickered out in the 10th century, Verdun's divisions had birthed something new, the fractured Europe of nations, where a united Christendom was just a fading memory. The treaty meant to end a family feud, instead penned the first draft of modern Europe's map, a legacy written in ink but sealed in blood. The first longships appeared on the horizon like black needles, sleek, fast, and utterly merciless. By the mid-9th century, Viking raiders had cracked the code of Europe's waterways, their shallow draft vessels slipping up the Rhine, Seine, and Loire rivers with terrifying ease. These weren't the hit-and-run coastal raids of earlier decades. The Northmen came to stay, wintering on conquered islands, extorting silver from trembling towns, and exploiting the Carolingian Empire's fatal flaw, a fractured defense system that couldn't coordinate across squabbling heirs. In 845, a fleet of 120 ships sailed straight into Paris, their axes glinting against the dawn. King Charles the Bald could only watch as they burned the suburbs, finally paying them £7,000 of silver to leave, a ransom that merely whetted their appetite. The Vikings had discovered a gold mine in Carolingian disunity, and they'd keep coming back for generations. While the Northmen harried the coasts and rivers, a new storm gathered in the east. The Magyars, nomadic horsemen from the Eurasian steppe, swept into the Danube basin like a whirlwind. Mounted on agile ponies, their composite bows could pierce Frankish armor at 200 paces, and their lightning raids left no time for local counts to muster defenses. By 900, these invaders had turned much of East Francia into a wasteland of smoldering monasteries and emptied villages. The Carolingian response was pitifully fragmented. Louis the German's successors lacked the manpower to protect the frontier, so regional dukes like Arnulf of Carinthia took matters into their own hands, forging private armies that further eroded imperial authority. The Magyars didn't just bring destruction, they accelerated the shift from centralized rule to feudal warlordism. Then came the southern blows. Muslim forces, having held parts of Spain since the 8th century, began pushing northward. Corsairs from Al-Andalus sacked Marseille in 848, while other groups established bases in the Alps, cutting trade routes between Italy and the Frankish heartlands. In the Mediterranean, Arab fleets turned the sea into a no-go zone, strangling the economic lifelines that had once fed Carolingian prosperity. The empire's southern marches, already neglected by rulers focused on Saxon and Breton revolts, crumbled under the pressure. When the Abbey of St. Genis des Fontaines was pillaged in 918, its monks didn't even bother sending a plea for help to the distant Carolingian king. They knew none would come. What made these invasions so devastating wasn't just their violence, but their timing. The Carolingian military machine, designed for Charlemagne's offensive wars, floundered when forced onto the defensive. Viking warbands exploited river networks faster than horseback messengers could carry warnings. Magyar scouts knew the terrain better than Frankish generals. And Muslim raiders outmaneuvered garrisons still waiting for orders from kings, bogged down in dynastic squabbles. The empire's famed administrative cohesion, once its greatest strength, now left it sluggish and vulnerable. Local leaders, abandoned by the crown, struck their own deals, paying off Vikings with land, as in Normandy, or hiring Magyar mercenaries to fight rival nobles. Every such compromise chipped away at the illusion of Carolingian supremacy. The true measure of collapse lay in the silence of the scribes. Where 9th century annals boasted of imperial victories, 10th century chronicles tell quieter, grimmer tales. Monks in St. Denis wrote of bartering sacred relics for safety. Auchin's palace, once the hub of imperial governance, gathered dust while petty kings held court in fortified manors. Even the church, long the empire's ideological backbone, began looking elsewhere. Bishops now anointed local strongmen as protectors, blessing the rise of warlords like Robert the Strong, ancestor of the future Capetian dynasty. The invasions hadn't just weakened the Carolingians, they'd rewritten the rules of power, leaving a Europe where survival depended not on imperial titles, but on armed might and fractured loyalties. The dream of unity was drowning in fire and blood. The Carolingian crown was never meant to be shared, yet by the mid-9th century, every ambitious noble acted as if it were his birthright. Beneath the grand narrative of Viking raids and crumbling borders played a deadlier game, a chess match between emperors and their own vassals, where loyalty dissolved into betrayal with the brisk efficiency of a drawn dagger. Take the case of Count Hugh of Tours, a man whose lands stretched from the Rhine to the Alps. When Emperor Lothair demanded troops for another fruitless campaign in 840, Hugh simply shrugged, his obligations conveniently forgotten. This wasn't just defiance, it was a blueprint for rebellion copied by magnates across the fractured empire. What made these nobles so audacious? The answer lies in the very system Charlemagne designed. By granting counts control over vast territories, collecting taxes, leading armies, presiding over courts, he'd unwittingly created a generation of warlords who viewed their offices as personal property. No longer appointed at the emperor's pleasure, these positions became hereditary prizes, passed from father to son like cherished swords. The capitularies that once bound them now gathered dust in monastic libraries, their ink fading alongside imperial authority. And when kings like Charles the Bald tried to reclaim control, the backlash was swift and brutal. The rebellion of 858 exposed the rot. A coalition of nobles from Neustria and Aquitaine, led by the king's own brother-in-law, openly declared Charles unfit to rule. Their grievance, the king dared to revoke lands from disloyal vassals. These weren't revolutionaries, they were aristocrats protecting their privileges, cloaking self-interest in rhetoric about ancient customs. Charles survived by buying off some conspirators and crushing others, but the lesson was clear. The crown could no longer command, it had to negotiate. Regional identities further fractured the empire's fragile unity. In Aquitaine, local elites resisted Frankish rule with quiet stubbornness, preferring their own duke's authority to distant kings. Provence developed its own legal traditions, ignoring capitularies from Auchin. Even in the royal heartlands, nobles like the Robertians, ancestors of France's future kings, built private armies that outmatched the emperor's own. The Carolingians, once masters of Europe, now ruled by consent of the very men undermining them. The church, too, became a player in this power struggle. Bishops like Hincmar of Reims weren't just spiritual leaders. They were political operators, crowning kings one day and excommunicating rebellious nobles the next. When Louis the Stammerer seized the throne in 877, he didn't issue new laws. He signed the Capitulary of Quierzy, guaranteeing that nobles' lands would pass intact to their heirs. This wasn't governance, it was surrender, codifying the erosion of royal power into law. By the time Viking raiders sacked Paris in 885, the Carolingian crown had become a hollow relic. Regional assemblies, not kings, organized defenses. Fortresses built to repel invaders doubled as noble strongholds against royal authority. And when Charles the Fat paid silver to lift the Paris siege instead of fighting, his own nobles deposed him in disgust, a final indignity for a dynasty that had once commanded empires. The Carolingians still wore crowns until the 10th century, but real power now belonged to men who knew that swords, not parchment, forged the future. The empire's disintegration didn't leave a vacuum, it created opportunities. As Carolingian kings bickered over titles and Viking raids drained royal treasuries, a new class of power players emerged from the shadows, regional lords who understood that real authority wasn't granted by crowns but seized with swords and shrewd alliances. Among them, two dynasties would reshape Europe's future: the Robertians in West Francia and the Ottonians in the East. Their rise wasn't just about ambition, it was a masterclass in turning chaos into dominion. Take Robert the Strong, the patriarch of the Robertian clan. Officially, he was just a margrave tasked with defending the Loire Valley against Viking war bands. But as royal authority withered, Robert became something far more dangerous: a warlord who answered to no one. His strategy was simple yet brilliant. Instead of waiting for orders from distant kings, he fortified his own lands, hired mercenaries with Viking silver, and positioned himself as the last line of defense for terrified peasants. When Vikings sacked Paris in 856, it was Robert, not the Carolingian king, who rallied the counterattack. Townsfolk and lesser nobles didn't pledge allegiance to a fading empire, they flocked to the man who could actually protect them. By the time Robert fell in battle against the Northmen in 866, his family's influence was already entrenched, a private kingdom within a crumbling realm. East of the Rhine, a different power game unfolded. The Ottonians, descendants of a Saxon warlord named Liudolf, rose by exploiting the Carolingians' greatest weakness, their reliance on regional strongmen. When Magyar horsemen ravaged East Francia in the early 10th century, the feeble Carolingian ruler Charles the Fat proved useless, so the nobles turned to Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, a man who'd spent years fortifying hilltop castles and training heavy cavalry. Henry didn't just repel the Magyars at the Battle of Ried in 933. He reinvented warfare in the region, blending Saxon infantry traditions with Frankish tactics. His secret, giving local lords autonomy in exchange for military service, a proto-feudal contract that bound loyalty to capability, not bloodlines. What made these regional powers so formidable wasn't just military might, but their ability to repurpose Carolingian systems. The Robertians and Ottonians didn't burn administrative records, they used them. Old imperial counties became hereditary fiefs, Carolingian tax rolls morphed into rent ledgers, and even the missi dominici model evolved into networks of vassals reporting to local dukes. The church, desperate for protection, anointed these upstarts as God's chosen bishops, crowned Robert's son Odo as king of West Francia in 888, while Henry's son Otto would later be hailed as Holy Roman Emperor. This shift from empire to feudalism wasn't a sudden collapse but a slow metamorphosis. The Carolingians had believed in centralized rule, their counts as interchangeable administrators. The new lords saw land as personal property, loyalty as a negotiable contract. When Vikings or Magyars struck, peasants didn't cry for an absent emperor. They bartered harvests for a local lord's protection. Walls rose around towns not by royal decree, but because regional strongmen needed defensible trade hubs. Even language fractured. The the Latin of Charlemagne's court gave way to early French and German dialects, each reflecting the distinct worlds taking shape on either side of the Rhine. By the time the last Carolingian ruler died childless in 987, the transformation was complete. Hugh Capet, Robert the Strong's great-grandson, claimed the French throne with barely a murmur of dissent. In Germany, Otto the Great's Ottoman dynasty ruled an embryonic kingdom that would birth the Holy Roman Empire. The irony was profound. The very tools Charlemagne had forged to unite Europe now served to divide it, reshaped by men who understood that in the ashes of empire, power flows not from titles, but from the ability to hold a sword in one hand and a deed to the land in the other. Charles the Fat inherited a fractured kingdom and the ghost of an empire. Crowned emperor in 881, he was the last Carolingian to briefly reunite the vast territories his great-grandfather Charlemagne had ruled. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Europe might remember what unity felt like. Charles held East Francia, Italy, and by 885 West Francia too. But this wasn't the triumphant reunification of legend. It was an accident of dynastic survival, a patchwork of lands stitched together because other male heirs had died. And the seams showed from the start. His reign was less a revival than a desperate salvage operation. When the Viking Great Heathen Army laid siege to Paris in 885, Charles didn't lead a heroic relief force, he negotiated. Promising the Northmen £700 of silver and free passage up the Seine to raid Burgundy, he bought peace at the cost of his credibility. To the besieged Parisians, it was betrayal. To regional nobles, proof the crown could no longer protect them. The irony was cruel. The man who'd reassembled the empire lacked the will to defend it. The cracks spread beyond Viking threats. In Italy, local magnates bristled under Frankish rule, while East Frankish nobles grumbled about Charles's obsession with his western lands. His health didn't help. Epileptic seizures left him prone to bouts of incapacitation, fueling rumors of weakness. By 887, the dam broke. His nephew Arnulf of Carinthia, an illegitimate but battle-hardened Carolingian, rallied East Frankish nobles in open revolt. At the Diet of Triber that November, they did the unthinkable, deposed an emperor. Not through assassination or civil war, but with a vote. Charles, stripped of title and dignity, retreated to a Swabian estate where he died within months, a footnote in his own reign. His downfall wasn't just personal failure, it exposed the empire's fatal flaw. Without Charlemagne's charisma or administrative genius, the Carolingian system couldn't function. The counts and bishops who'd once obeyed imperial decrees now answered to regional warlords. The church, once the dynasty's staunchest ally, shifted its allegiance to men who could fight Vikings rather than pay them off. Even the idea of a united Christendom shattered. When Arnulf took power, he didn't claim the entire empire, just East Francia, leaving the west to the Robertians. The year 887 didn't just end a reign, it closed a chapter. No Carolingian would ever again rule all of Charlemagne's domains. In its place rose something new, a Europe of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities, where power flowed from local strongholds rather than imperial palaces. Yet Charles's shadow lingered. His deposition proved an empire built on family legacy couldn't survive without competence, and that lesson would echo through the centuries every time a ruler mistook bloodlines for destiny. West Francia in the late 9th century was a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse, its rivers choked with Viking longships, its fields scorched by rival nobles, and its Carolingian kings reduced to bargaining with invaders they could no longer defeat. At the center of this storm stood Charles the Simple, a ruler whose name belied the brutal complexity of his reign. Crowned in 898 after years of noble infighting, he inherited a realm where the very word king had begun to sound like an empty title. Yet this unassuming monarch would make a decision that reshaped Europe, one forged not on the battlefield, but at a negotiating table with a Viking chieftain named Rollo. The Northmen had become West France's recurring nightmare. Unlike earlier hit-and-run raids, these were full-scale occupations. Viking fleets overwintered on islands in the Seine and Loire, turning them into fortified bases. By 911, Rollo's forces controlled vast stretches of Normandy, burning monasteries and extorting silver with impunity. Charles, recognizing the futility of resistance, made an audacious gamble. He offered Rollo not just silver but land. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte was a masterstroke of desperation. In exchange for swearing fealty to the crown, converting to Christianity, and defending the Seine from other Viking bands, Rollo and his men received the territory that would become Normandy, a name that still echoes their Norse origins. On paper, this looked like surrender. In reality, it was survival. Rollo's Normans proved surprisingly effective vassals, their ferocity now directed against other raiders rather than Frankish towns. They adopted French customs with Viking adaptability, blending Norse warfare with Frankish feudalism to create a warrior culture that would later produce William the Conqueror. But the treaty also exposed the Carolingian crown's weakness. Charles had to buy loyalty he could no longer command. When he later tried to reclaim Lorraine from East Francia, his own nobles, led by Robert of Neustria, rebelled and imprisoned him. The king who had pacified the Vikings found himself outmaneuvered by the very aristocracy meant to serve him. This shifting balance of power set the stage for the Carolingians' final act. After Charles's death in 929, the throne passed through a series of ineffectual heirs while real authority coalesced around regional dynasties, none more formidable than the Robertians. Hugh the Great, son of the martyred Robert the Strong, wielded power like a shadow king, installing and deposing Carolingian monarchs at will. His son, Hugh Capet, would complete the transition in 987 when nobles bypassed the last Carolingian claimant to crown him. The Capetians didn't seize power through rebellion. They simply let the Carolingian flame gutter out, then stepped into the void. What's striking isn't just the Carolingians' fall, but how quietly it happened. There were no epic battles, no dramatic last stands, just a gradual transfer of influence from a waning dynasty to rising warlords. The Capetians, initially weak themselves, would spend centuries rebuilding centralized authority, crafting myths that tied their legitimacy to Charlemagne's legacy even as they erased his descendants. West Francia's struggle didn't end with the Carolingians. It merely entered a new chapter, one where Viking bloodlines and Frankish crowns intertwined to shape the France we know today. The kingdom survived its kings, proving that even as dynasties die, the lands they rule endure. East Francia's transformation from a crumbling Carolingian frontier to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire wasn't inevitable. It was forged by two men who understood the raw calculus of power. Henry the Fowler never wore an emperor's crown, yet his reign laid the stones for a dynasty that would outshine the Carolingians. When the East Frankish nobles elected him king in 919, they weren't choosing a figurehead. They were rallying behind a warlord who'd spent years outmaneuvering Magyar raiders and Saxon rebels. Henry's genius lay in his pragmatism. While Carolingian rulers clung to imperial pageantry, he focused on survival, building fortress towns like Quedlinburg where cavalry could muster swiftly, and striking deals with Slavic tribes to secure his eastern flank. His victory over the Magyars at Ried in 933 wasn't just a battle won, it was a statement that East Francia would no longer be a punching bag for invaders. Henry's son Otto inherited not just a kingdom but a blueprint for empire. Crowned in 936, Otto the Great didn't waste time on nostalgia for the Carolingian past. He rebuilt its essence through steel and sacrament. His early reign was a masterclass in crushing rebellion. When his own brothers joined forces with Frankish nobles to challenge him, Otto smashed their armies at Andernach in 939, then executed the ringleaders with theatrical brutality. This wasn't mere vengeance, it was political theater designed to shock the aristocracy into submission. Unlike the Carolingians who'd bargained with rebellious vassals, Otto understood that fear could bind where loyalty frayed. The real turning point came in 955 on the Lechfeld Plain. The Magyars, emboldened by decades of raiding, launched their largest invasion yet. Otto didn't just repel them, he annihilated their forces with a combined army of Bavarians, Franks, and Bohemians, then hunted down the survivors until the Magyar threat evaporated. This victory did more than secure borders. It minted Otto as Europe's defender, a title he leveraged to resurrect Charlemagne's imperial dream. When Pope John XII begged his help against Italian warlords in 961, Otto crossed the Alps not as a mercenary but as a conqueror. His coronation in Rome the following year didn't just create the Holy Roman Empire, it redefined what empire meant in a fractured age. The Ottonian system was Carolingian governance rebuilt for a darker world. Bishops became Otto's secret weapon, educated, unmarried men whose loyalty couldn't be diluted by hereditary ambitions. He granted them lands and imperial privileges, creating a network of warrior prelates like Bruno of Cologne who could administer territories and lead armies. This imperial church system gave Otto leverage against the duchies, balancing secular and sacred power in a way the Carolingians never mastered. Even his cultural revival had teeth. Ottonian monasteries produced illuminated manuscripts rivaling Otto's glory days, but their scriptoria also doubled as intelligence hubs monitoring noble descent. What set the Ottonians apart wasn't just their military might, but their vision of empire as a divine project. Where the Carolingians had treated the papacy as a partner, Otto reduced it to a tool, deposing John XII for treason and installing his own candidates. When his son Otto III later dreamed of a renovatio imperii with Rome as its capital, he wasn't merely copying Charlemagne, he was claiming the mantle of a new Constantine. The irony was rich. The dynasty that saved East Francia from collapse became the engine of a medieval superstate, proving that in the ashes of one empire, the seeds of another always stir. Middle Francia was the empire's fragile spine, a sprawling, vulnerable corridor that connected the North Sea to the Mediterranean, yet could never quite hold itself together. When Lothair I inherited this central strip at the Treaty of Verdun in 843, he believed he'd won the grand prize, Rome, Aachen, and the imperial title itself. But geography had cursed him. Sandwiched between his brother's stronger realms, Middle Francia was less a kingdom than a highway for every ambitious warlord in Europe. Its borders snaked through marshes and mountains, impossible to defend, while its people, Burgundians, Lombards, Provençals, shared little beyond resentment of Frankish rule. Lothair's inheritance wasn't just fragile, it was a slow-motion collapse waiting to happen. The first fracture came swiftly. When Lothair died in 855, his sons carved Middle Francia into even thinner slices. Lothair II took the northern lands, an awkward territory soon called Lotharingia after him. Charles received Provence and Louis got Italy. This wasn't just division, it was dismemberment. Lotharingia, straddling the Rhine and Meuse rivers, became a geopolitical prize with no natural defenses, its fertile valleys and trading hubs too tempting for its neighbors to ignore. Within a generation, East and West Francia would treat it like a disputed chessboard, their armies trampling its fields in a tug of war that lasted centuries. What made Lotharingia's fate so tragic was its potential. Its cities Aachen, Metz, Verdun had been the Carolingian heartland, filled with imperial palaces and bustling markets. The Rhine trade route pumped wealth through its veins, while its monasteries housed some of Europe's finest scholars. But without strong central rule, these advantages became liabilities. Local nobles like the Counts of Flanders and the Dukes of Lorraine quickly realized they could play both sides, pledging allegiance to whichever Frankish king offered more land or silver. Loyalty became a commodity bought and sold with cynical precision. The Battle of Fontenoy in 841 had been a warning. When Lothair and his brothers clashed over their father's inheritance, Frankish blood soaked the soil of Burgundy, and the chronicles whispered of the Field of Lies. But the real betrayal came decades later when Lotharingia's own elites turned against each other. In 870, the Treaty of Meersen forced Lothair II's realm to be split between his uncles Charles the Bald and Louis the German. The division was crude, slicing through villages and farmsteads with no regard for culture or language. Families found themselves on opposite sides of a border that shifted with every new skirmish or royal marriage. By the 10th century, Lotharingia was less a kingdom than a battleground. The Rhine became a front line in the feud between the rising Ottonians of East Francia and the Robertians of West Francia. When the last Carolingian claimant, Duke Charles of Lower Lorraine, tried to reclaim his birthright in 978, he was crushed by Ottonian forces at Soissons, a final nail in the coffin of Middle Francia's independence. The irony was bitter. The lands that had birthed Charlemagne's empire now existed only as a disputed buffer, their identity erased by the very dynasties that owed their existence to Carolingian blood. Yet Lotharingia's ghost never fully vanished. Its borders linger in modern Europe, in the cultural split between French-speaking Wallonia and German-speaking Flanders, in the quarrels over Alsace and Lorraine, even in the bureaucratic maze of the European Union's Brussels headquarters. The kingdom disappeared from maps, but its divisions etched themselves into the continent's DNA. The true lesson of Middle Francia wasn't just about the fragility of empires, but the stubbornness of geography, how rivers and mountains outlast crowns, and how lands caught between giants never quite forget they were once the center of the world. The scriptoria fell silent, where monks once hunched over parchment, meticulously copying Cicero and Augustine by candlelight. Now only dust gathered on abandoned writing desks. The Carolingian Renaissance, that brief, brilliant flowering of learning, withered as quickly as it had bloomed. Libraries stood empty, their shelves ransacked for firewood by freezing peasants or plundered by raiders who prized jeweled book covers more than the wisdom inside. A monk in St. Gall lamented that even the simplest psalters had become too expensive to replace, their pages crumbling like dried leaves. This wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the slow suffocation of an intellectual revolution. Infrastructure crumbled with terrifying swiftness. Roman roads that had survived for 800 years, carefully maintained by Carolingian engineers, now cracked under neglect, their stone pavements swallowed by mud. Bridges collapsed into rivers, cutting off trade routes that had once pulsed with imperial couriers and merchant caravans. In Aachen, Charlemagne's magnificent palace complex leaked rain through rotting beams, its marble floors strewn with straw where squatters slept. The empire's heartbeat had been its network of way stations, where fresh horses waited to speed messages from Bordeaux to Regensburg. Now riders took weeks to cover distances once traveled in days if they arrived at all. Economic decay crept in like a slow poison. The silver denarius, standardized by Charlemagne to unify trade, became so debased that merchants refused it. A sack of coins might buy a loaf of bread one year and nothing the next. With Vikings controlling the Seine and Rhone rivers, wine shipments from Aquitaine vanished, leaving monasteries unable to celebrate Mass. Peasants who once paid taxes in grain now huddled behind wooden palisades, their fields burned or untended. The carefully calibrated weights and measures of imperial markets gave way to local fraud. A bushel in Flanders held far less than one in Burgundy, breeding distrust that choked commerce. Most tragic was the loss of collective memory. Carolingian scribes had preserved not just Christian texts but pagan philosophy, Roman engineering manuals, even scraps of Greek astronomy. As monasteries emptied, this knowledge slipped into obscurity. Archimedes' calculations erased by damp, Livy's histories burned for warmth. The unified Latin script that had made texts readable from Brittany to Bavaria fractured into regional scrolls, some so idiosyncratic that a monk from Tours couldn't decipher a charter written in Cologne. Literacy, once nurtured by palace schools, became the guarded secret of a few cloistered clerics. Charlemagne's dream of an educated clergy dwindled into a time when even bishops sometimes signed documents with a cross. Yet amid the ruin, flickers of the Renaissance persisted. In remote Irish monasteries like Clonmacnoise, monks still copied manuscripts in flawless minuscule, their isolation now a shield against continental chaos. Arab scholars in Cordoba preserved Aristotle's works that Europe had forgotten, waiting for calmer days when ideas could cross the Pyrenees again. And in the confusion of the 10th century, an odd pattern emerged. The very warlords pillaging monasteries often hired surviving scribes to draft their charters, unwittingly keeping literacy on life support. The Carolingian light didn't vanish. It fractured into 1,000 fragile candles, each guarding a fragment of the empire's brilliance against the gathering dark. With the Carolingian Empire in tatters, a new force rose to fill the vacuum not with swords, but with sacred vestments and parchment bulls. The Church, once a steadfast ally of imperial power, now found itself the only institution spanning Europe's fractured realms. Pope Nicholas I set the tone in the mid-9th century, declaring that no secular ruler could judge a pontiff, a direct challenge to the old Carolingian model where emperors had presided over popes like earthly overseers. When Lothair II of Lotharingia tried to divorce his wife, Nicholas excommunicated entire royal courts until the king backed down. This wasn't just spiritual authority, it was raw political theater, proving that in a world of crumbling crowns, the keys of St. Peter could unlock more doors than a rusted imperial scepter. The investiture controversy of the 11th century exposed how drastically the balance had shifted. When Emperor Henry IV appointed his own bishop in Milan, Pope Gregory VII thundered back with an ultimatum. Clergy were answerable to Rome alone, and any ruler who dared interfere faced eternal damnation. Henry's retaliatory letter, addressed to Hildebrand, not pope but false monk, earned him excommunication and a winter of humiliation. Barefoot in the snow outside Canossa Castle, the emperor waited 3 days before Gregory granted absolution. The spectacle sent shockwaves through Europe. A pope had reduced an emperor to a shivering supplicant. This was no longer the Church of Charlemagne's day, when bishops marched with imperial armies. Now spiritual authority could topple thrones. Monasteries became the unsung architects of this transformation. At Cluny in Burgundy, a quiet revolution unfolded as reformers rejected noble control over abbeys, demanding direct allegiance to Rome. Their influence spread like wildfire by the year 1100. Over 1,000 monasteries followed the Cluniac model, their networks bypassing local lords to answer only to the Pope. These weren't just retreats for prayer, they were power nodes. Monks preserved land records, mediated disputes, and even minted coins when royal authority faltered. In the chaos of Viking raids and feudal wars, a traveler might find no functioning courts or markets, but the local monastery still stood, its scriptorium buzzing with clerks drafting contracts under the watchful eye of an abbot who reported to Rome, not some petty count. The irony was profound. Charlemagne had harnessed the church to unify his empire, but his successors lost control of the very institution they'd empowered. By the time the last Carolingian died, the papacy had morphed into a medieval superpower, commanding armies, crowning kings, and even launching crusades. The dream of a united Christendom lived on, but its capital was no longer Aachen or Rome. It resided wherever a monk copied a papal decree, a bishop anointed a warlord, or a penitent ruler knelt before a pope's envoy. The Carolingians had sought to marry throne and altar. Their failure birthed an era where the altar dared to claim the throne. Napoleon Bonaparte stood before Charlemagne's jewel-encrusted crown in Aachen's cathedral, his fingers hovering just above the relic as if absorbing its power through proximity. It was 1804, and the French emperor had come to this ancient city not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim, one conqueror paying homage to another. With theatrical flourish, he removed the crown from its case and placed it briefly on his own head, a silent declaration that he, too, was heir to Charlemagne's legacy. This moment, staged for maximum symbolism, reveals a startling truth. Long after the Carolingian Empire crumbled, it lived on as Europe's most potent political myth. The Carolingian revival wasn't just Napoleon's obsession, it was a recurring fever dream for rulers desperate to cloak their ambitions in ancient glory. Otto the Great modeled his imperial coronation in 962 after Charlemagne's, deliberately choosing the same Roman Church. Frederick Barbarossa had Charlemagne's bones exhumed in 1215, seeking divine favor for his wars. Even Hitler would later cite the Carolingian conquest of Saxony as precedent for Nazi expansion eastward. What made this long-dead empire so irresistible? The answer lies in its duality. It was both nostalgically medieval and startlingly modern, a warrior kingdom that also promised cultural unity, a template any aspiring unifier of Europe could exploit. Romantic nationalism in the 19th century transformed Charlemagne from a historical figure into a cultural Rorschach test. French schoolbooks painted him as the prototypical Frenchman, his court at Aachen a mere outpost of Gallic genius. German historians countered fiercely, pointing to his Saxon campaigns and burial in German soil as proof of Teutonic roots. Belgian pamphlets claimed him through his Flemish ancestry, while Italian nationalists highlighted his papal coronation as evidence of Latin supremacy. This tug of war over his legacy wasn't academic. It was about claiming the moral authority to redraw maps. When the European Union named its prestigious research grants after Charlemagne in 1957, the subtext was clear. Here was the original architect of a united Europe, resurrected for the atomic age. The myth-making often glossed over uncomfortable truths. Charlemagne's empire had been built on forced conversions and mass executions, its unity fleeting, its administration reliant on terror as much as piety. Napoleon's invocation of Carolingian glory ignored how Lotharingia, the Middle Kingdom, had become history's cautionary tale about unsustainable borders. Modern Eurosceptics would later weaponize this selective memory, asking whether Brussels' bureaucracy echoed Charlemagne's heavy-handed counts more than his visionary scholars. Yet the myth endures because it answers a deep human longing for order after chaos, for light in dark times. When post-war Europe lay in ruins, Charlemagne's ghost whispered that fragmentation wasn't inevitable. His empire, however brief, proved that diverse peoples could share laws, coins, and even dreams. That's why his throne still stands in Aachen, empty but waiting, a silent challenge to every generation. Can you do better? Beneath the cobblestone streets of Aachen lies a time capsule of imperial ambition. The ruins of Charlemagne's palace, unearthed layer by layer like a grand puzzle waiting to be solved. Archaeologists in the 1960s stumbled upon something extraordinary beneath the town hall, the foundations of a monumental octagonal chapel, its geometry mirroring Byzantine churches in Ravenna. This wasn't just a place of worship, it was the beating heart of an empire. The discovery of the Königspfalz, or Royal Palace Complex, revealed a sprawling network of heated baths, banquet halls, and even a swimming pool fed by natural hot springs, luxuries so advanced they wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Charlemagne's throne, a stark slab of marble perched on a dais, still sits where he once held court, its strategic placement allowing the emperor to survey the entire chapel below. Every stone tells a story of calculated grandeur, a ruler who understood that power thrives in spectacle. Equally revealing are the humble artifacts often overlooked, like the meticulously labeled bone combs found in nearby workshops, their teeth spaced precisely for lice removal. These everyday objects whisper of an empire obsessed with order, where even personal hygiene was standardized. Modern LiDAR scans have since mapped the full extent of Aachen's imperial quarter, exposing a carefully planned grid of streets radiating from the palace, a deliberate echo of ancient Rome's urban design. But the real revelation came from tree ring dating of oak beams. The palace rose in a staggering 10-year construction spree, a feat only possible with thousands of forced laborers and looted Roman bricks hauled from distant ruins. Then there are the manuscripts, not just texts but treasure troves of hidden history. The Lorsch Gospels, crafted around 810, dazzle with their gold leaf illuminations, but it's the marginalia that fascinates scholars. Tiny notes scribbled by monks reveal bitter disputes over ink quality and stolen parchment, exposing the human chaos behind Carolingian perfection. Multispectral imaging has since uncovered erased passages in texts like the Codex Carolinus, where political compromises were literally scrubbed from record. One palimpsest in Verona even preserves Charlemagne's own handwriting, clumsy Latin corrected by Alcuin's patient quill, proving the emperor's famous passion for learning wasn't just propaganda. New technologies are rewriting Carolingian history before our eyes. Isotope analysis of teeth from graves near Ingelheim shows soldiers buried there hailed from as far as Scandinavia and Hungary, confirming the empire's astonishing ethnic diversity. Drones equipped with thermal cameras have located lost monastic vineyards in Burgundy, their boundaries matching precisely with 9th century capitularies on wine production. Even sewage archaeology plays a role. Cores taken from Aachen's ancient latrines contain traces of exotic spices like cumin and pepper, direct evidence of trade routes stretching to Baghdad. Perhaps the most poignant discovery came from a nondescript field in Saxony, a mass grave filled with skeletons bearing execution wounds, their bones carbon dated to the year 782, the very year Charlemagne ordered the Verdun massacre. Forensic analysis revealed some victims were adolescents, their teeth marked by childhood malnutrition. This grim find forces us to confront the empire's dark side, where cultural unity was forged at sword point. Yet in a twist only archaeology could provide, nearby excavations uncovered Saxon households using Frankish pottery and crucifixes within a generation, proving assimilation's messy reality. The Carolingian world emerges from these fragments not as a static golden age, but as a dynamic, contradictory civilization, one where scholars debated Aristotle under candlelight while slaves built the palaces where those ideas were celebrated. Every broken loom weight, every coin minted with a misspelled Latin inscription, every gospel book stained with wine tells us this. Empires aren't monuments but living things, breathing through the cracks between their grand designs and human frailty. And as long as shovels break earth and scanners pierce vellum, their stories will keep surfacing, demanding we listen. The question of whether the Carolingian Empire was destined to collapse has divided historians for centuries, sparking debates as fierce as the Saxon wars themselves. On one side stand scholars like Heinrich Fichtenau, who argue that Charlemagne's empire was a fragile illusion, an overstretched patchwork of territories held together by little more than one man's charisma. They point to the fatal flaw at its core, a governance system built for conquest, not longevity, with no professional bureaucracy, no standing army, and no clear succession plan beyond the Frankish tradition of dividing lands among heirs. The empire was a towering edifice on crumbling foundations. Even Charlemagne's vaunted administrative reforms, like the Missi Dominii, relied on personal loyalty rather than institutional stability. When the emperor's iron grip vanished, so too did the cohesion of his realm. But other historians, such as Pierre Richer, push back fiercely. They argue that the empire didn't collapse because it was flawed, it fractured because later rulers failed to adapt Charlemagne's vision. Richer's research highlights how the Carolingian Renaissance created frameworks that outlasted the empire itself. Standardized weights and measures, a revival of classical learning, and legal traditions that shaped medieval Europe for centuries. The problem wasn't Charlemagne's reforms, but his successors' inability to maintain them. Louis the Pious, for instance, inherited a functioning system but prioritized piety over pragmatism, alienating the nobles who were the empire's backbone. Had later rulers matched Charlemagne's political acumen, the empire might have endured as Rome once did. A third camp, led by scholars like Janet Nelson, takes a more nuanced view. They suggest the empire was simultaneously resilient and doomed, a paradox rooted in its hybrid nature. Charlemagne had fused Germanic tribal customs with Roman imperial ambition, creating a system that worked brilliantly under his leadership but contained irreconcilable tensions. The very act of coronation in 800, for example, tied imperial authority to the church in ways that later sparked the investiture controversy. Meanwhile, the reliance on conquest for wealth created a vicious cycle. Each new territory demanded more soldiers, which required more land grants to nobles, which in turn eroded centralized control. The empire wasn't destined to fail, but its success planted the seeds of its own unraveling. Archaeology has added fuel to the debate. Excavations at sites like Dorstad, once a bustling Carolingian trade hub, reveal thriving economies abruptly abandoned in the mid-9th century, proof, some argue, that Viking raids and internal strife shattered a functioning system. Yet isotopic analysis of bones from Frankish graves tells a different story. Malnutrition and overworked populations even at the empire's height, suggesting structural weaknesses long before external threats arrived. The truth may lie somewhere in between an empire that was always vulnerable but whose collapse was accelerated by a perfect storm of invasions, dynastic squabbles, and environmental pressures like the medieval warm period's crop failures. Perhaps the most provocative theory comes from historian Chris Wickham, who argues that the Carolingian Empire didn't so much fall as mutate. Its fragmentation into smaller kingdoms, France, Germany, Italy, wasn't failure but evolution, adapting governance to a world where local power mattered more than imperial grandeur. The Carolingian bloodline faded, but its legacy lived on in feudal contracts, monastic networks, and even the dream of a united Europe that Napoleon and modern EU architects would later invoke. In this light, the empire's end wasn't tragedy but transformation, proof that in history, as in nature, nothing truly dies. It just takes new forms. The Carolingian Empire's collapse wasn't just a medieval tragedy, it was a masterclass in the limits of power, one that whispers warnings to modern states and supranational unions alike. Consider the EU's struggle to balance national sovereignty with collective governance, a tension eerily reminiscent of Charlemagne's counts chafing under imperial decrees. Or the United States' military overreach in the Middle East, echoing the Carolingian dilemma of securing distant frontiers while neglecting heartland stability. Like Charlemagne's reliance on personal charisma, modern populist movements hinge on singular leaders whose exit leaves vacuums, proof that systems built around individuals crumble when those figures fade. What makes these parallels unsettling is how the Carolingians confronted challenges we still grapple with today. Take cultural integration. Charlemagne's forced baptisms of Saxons mirror modern debates over assimilation versus multiculturalism. His empire splintered not just from Viking raids, but because Lombard nobles, Bavarian clans, and Aquitanian lords never fully saw themselves as Carolingians. Fast forward to contemporary Europe, where Brexit and Catalonian independence movements reveal how administrative unions often paper over unhealed regional identities. The lesson, coercive unity backfires, lasting cohesion requires more than shared currency or legal codes. Then there's the trap of overexpansion, the Carolingian Empire's vast borders. From Barcelona to Budapest became impossible to defend, draining resources with constant revolts and invasions. Modern parallels abound: Rome's imperial overstretch, the Soviet Union's satellite states, even tech empires like WeWork's global sprawl preceding collapse. Charlemagne's fatal assumption that conquered peoples would remain passive haunts every expansionist power. When resources thin and local elites grow restless, the periphery devours the core. Yet the most chilling lesson lies in governance. The Carolingians relied on a hybrid system, part Roman bureaucracy, part Germanic kinship ties that functioned only under energetic leadership. Sound familiar? From Venezuela's reliance on oil-funded patronage to Afghanistan's central government evaporating without US support, history shows administrative systems that lack institutional depth are time bombs. Charlemagne's missi dominici worked because he personally appointed them. When weak emperors delegated oversight, corruption festered. Modern democracies face similar risks when independent institutions erode in favor of personalized rule. But here's the twist: the Carolingian legacy also offers hope. Their cultural Renaissance monasteries preserving knowledge through turmoil proves that even in collapse, foundations endure. Today's digital archives and global universities serve a similar role, safeguarding progress against political shocks. The empire's fragmentation birthed nations that still thrive, suggesting that sometimes decentralization isn't failure but adaptation. When viewers ask if empires can avoid the Carolingian fate, the answer isn't yes or no. It's that empires transform rather than disappear. The real question is whether we're building systems resilient enough to guide that transformation, or merely replaying 8th century mistakes with 21st century tech. From the pixelated battlefields of video games to the sweeping dramas of Hollywood, Charlemagne and his Carolingian Empire have been resurrected countless times, though rarely with historical precision. Take the 2023 Netflix series The Last Kingdom, 7 Kings Must Die, where Charlemagne's legacy looms like a shadow over England's fractured kingdoms. The show's Frankish envoys stride onto screen in gleaming plate armor, an invention 6 centuries premature, wielding the gravitas of empire while name-dropping Aachen like a medieval power broker's capital. It's gripping television, but the real Charlemagne would scarcely recognize this version of his realm, where timelines collapse and political nuance is sacrificed for Saxon versus Viking showdowns. Gaming worlds butcher the details with even more creative liberty. Crusader Kings Roman III lets players mold the Carolingian Empire like digital clay, rewriting history with every campaign. Want to prevent the Treaty of Verdun? Go ahead. Fancy converting Lotharingia to a pagan warlord state? The game won't stop you. While the broad strokes, dynastic feuds, Viking raids, are loosely accurate, the gameplay mechanics oversimplify the empire's fragile alliances. The missi dominici function as mere tax collectors, ignoring their role as cultural enforcers, and Charlemagne's brutal Saxon wars are reduced to a piety bonus for forced conversions. Yet paradoxically, these distortions spark curiosity. Players who sack Paris as Ragnar Lodbrok often find themselves Googling the real siege of Paris, bridging fantasy and scholarship. Literature takes a more contemplative approach. James Rowland's The Last Oracle weaves Carolingian cryptograms into a modern thriller, playing fast and loose with Alcuin's manuscripts but capturing the era's obsession with encoded knowledge. Meanwhile, historical novels like The Sword of Charlemagne romanticize the emperor as a chivalric proto-Arthur, his flaws airbrushed away. The trend isn't new. Medieval troubadours themselves mythologized Charlemagne as early as the Song of Roland, transforming the messy reality of Roncevaux's pass into a tale of Christian martyrdom. Pop culture didn't invent these exaggerations, it inherited them from a millennium of storytelling. Even music bends the Carolingians to its will. Power metal bands like Blind Guardian scream lyrics about the hammer of the Carolingian might, conveniently glossing over Charles Martel's less heroic tax policies. Meanwhile, Viking folk bands compose ballads mocking Frankish tyranny, reversing the empire's own propaganda. These artistic liberties matter because they shape public memory. For every viewer who discovers the real Carolingians through a Civilization VI campaign, another walks away believing Charlemagne wielded Excalibur. The tension between myth and reality reveals something profound. We don't resurrect empires as they were, but as we need them to be. The Carolingians symbolize order in chaos, a lost golden age or a cautionary tale about overreach depending on who's telling the story. When Assassin's Creed inevitably sets a game in Carolingian Europe, it won't be the historical option we see, but a funhouse mirror reflecting our own longing for unity, conquest, or the thrill of watching giants fall. The rise of the Carolingian Empire reads like a saga of raw ambition meeting divine providence. It began with Charles Martel's hammer blows at Tours, continued through Pepin the Short's audacious coup against the Merovingians, and reached its dazzling zenith when Charlemagne knelt in St. Peter's Basilica on that fateful Christmas morning. Here was an empire forged equally by battlefield blood and Inca quills, where warrior kings presided over scholarly revivals, where pagan Saxons were baptized at sword point even as monks preserved Aristotle's wisdom. For a brief, shining moment, Europe remembered what unity felt like: roads patrolled by imperial envoys, markets buzzing with standardized silver coins, and the luminous glow of scholarship emerging from the so-called Dark Ages. But golden ages are fleeting by nature. The same forces that built the empire, relentless expansion, dependence on royal charisma, the delicate dance between throne and altar, became the cracks that shattered it. Louis the Pious' well-intentioned but disastrous partitions, the carving of Verdun, the Viking raids exposing hollow defenses. Each collapse revealed the fragility beneath the imperial veneer. By the time regional warlords like the Robertians and Ottonians picked up the pieces, the dream of a united Christendom had fragmented into rival kingdoms speaking embryonic versions of French and German. The administrative brilliance of the Missi Dominici gave way to feudal strongmen. The flowing Latin of palace schools degenerated into local dialects. The very roads that once connected Aachen to Rome crumbled under neglect. So was this empire ultimately a triumph or a cautionary tale? The answer depends on where you look. For all its violence and coercion, Charlemagne's realm preserved the intellectual seeds that would later flower into universities and cathedrals. His bureaucratic innovations laid groundwork for modern governance, while the coronation of 800 created a template for church-state relations that shaped Europe for a millennium. Yet the empire's rapid disintegration also teaches brutal lessons about overextension, about the dangers of personalizing power, about how easily unity fractures when the glue of fear and ambition dissolves. Perhaps the most haunting legacy isn't in history books, but in the questions we still grapple with today. How much diversity can a union tolerate before it splinters? Can military might ever truly forge lasting cohesion? When does centralization become oppression? The Carolingian Empire lives on as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that even the grandest political constructs are ultimately human, all too human. So what do you think? Was Charlemagne's vision a blueprint for civilization or a castle built on sand? Share your thoughts below. After all, the conversation about empire never really ends, it just takes new forms.